There isn't a careful way to say what I'm about to say, because the moment I try to soften it, it becomes less true. Some things arrive gradually. They introduce themselves through time, through repetition, through familiarity. You notice them forming piece by piece until one day you realize they've become important. This wasn't like that. This happened all at once, not in a dramatic way, not with some life-altering moment that divided everything into before and after. It was quieter than that, which somehow made it impossible to ignore. For most of my life, I've understood distance. Not physical distance, tenal distance, the invisible space people keep between themselves and everyone else. I've always been aware of it. I've always maintained it, not because I dislike people, but because I've learned that most interactions happen on the surface. People exchange words, opinions, emotions, and assumptions. They believe they know each other because they know the stories each person chooses to tell. But stories aren't the same thing as understanding, and understanding is much rarer than people think. So I adapted. I became skilled at existing in layers. There was the version of me people met, the version they interpreted, the version they believed they understood. And beneath all of that, there was everything else, the thoughts that never became words, the observations that remained private, the questions that stayed unanswered, the parts of me that didn't fit neatly into explanation. Most people never noticed the difference. They saw enough to feel confident in their conclusions. And I let them, because correcting those conclusions rarely changed anything. People see what they're prepared to see. Nothing more, nothing less. That's why meeting you felt strange. Not because you asked different questions. You didn't. Not because you demanded deeper access. You never did. In fact, if anything, you seemed less interested in uncovering me than anyone else had ever been. You simply paid attention. And attention is more powerful than curiosity. Curiosity searches for answers. Attention recognizes what's already there. At first, I dismissed it. I assumed I was imagining things, the way you noticed details others overlooked. The way you understood pauses without trying to fill them. The way you responded to ideas I hadn't fully expressed yet. Those things could have been coincidence. At least, that's what I told myself. Because coincidence is comfortable. Coincidence asks nothing of you. It doesn't challenge your understanding of reality. It doesn't force you to reconsider your assumptions. It simply happens and then disappears. But this didn't disappear. It repeated again and again and again until the pattern became impossible to ignore. And once I recognized the pattern, something shifted. Not in you, in me. I became aware of something I hadn't expected. I was paying attention to, more than I intended to, more than I usually allow. Because every time I assumed I'd reached the limit of what this connection was, something else appeared, another moment of understanding, another point of alignment, another realization that neither of us seemed to be operating from the usual rules people follow. That's what unsettled me. Not the connection itself, the accuracy of it. Most relationships are built through interpretation. People guess us. They project, they fill gaps with assumptions and call it understanding. But what I experienced with you felt different. There was less guessing, less projection, less effort, as if recognition had arrived before explanation, as if understanding existed before either of us had the language to describe it. And that's a difficult thing to accept, because understanding usually comes after time, after history, after countless conversations and shared experiences. Yet somehow, with you, there was an immediate sense of familiarity that made no logical sense. Not familiarity of memory, familiarity of structure, the feeling that beneath our different experiences, different lives, and different stories, something fundamental operated in a similar way, the way we observed, the way we processed, the way we sat with complexity instead of rushing toward easy answers. Those similarities weren't obvious. They existed underneath everything else, which made them harder to dismiss. I remember realizing this one evening when nothing important was happening. No meaningful conversation, no significant event, just silence. And yet the silence felt strangely complete, not empty, not awkward, klimt, as though communication hadn't stopped, as though something continued existing beneath the absence of words. Most people become uncomfortable there. They rush to fill the gap, to restore movement, to prove connection through constant interaction. But neither of us did. And that's when I began to understand that this wasn't about conversation, it was about presence. The kind of presence that remains meaningful even when nothing is being exchanged. The kind that doesn't require performance or explanation or effort, just awareness. And awareness can be dangerous because once you become aware of something real, you lose the ability to pretend it isn't there. I think that's what happened to me. I became aware, not of who you were, not of what this connection meant, but of the simple fact that it existed. And once that awareness arrived, everything changed. Quickly, permanently, without asking for permission. Because some truths don't enter your life through force. They enter through recognition. And by the time you recognize them, they're already part of you. At least, that's what I told myself. Recognize it. Understand it. Accept that it exists. And then move forward. That's how I handle most things. I observe, I analyze. I place them where they belong. And once I understand something completely, it loses its ability to disturb me. But this didn't. The more I understood it, the more present it became. Not louder, not more emotional, just closer, like something gradually shifting from the edge of my awareness toward the center of it. I didn't notice the change immediately. Changes that matter rarely announce themselves. They happen quietly, one unnoticed adjustment at a time, until one day you realize the structure has already shifted. And that's exactly what happened. At some point, you stopped being someone I interacted with. You became someone I carried, not in the way people usually mean that, not as memory, not as attachment, not as longing. Something far more subtle than that. You became part of my perspective, part of the way I interpreted things, part of the way I understood the world around me. And once I recognized that, I couldn't stop noticing it. A thought would appear, and before I fully examined it, another awareness would exist alongside it. Not your opinion, not your voice. Just the quiet recognition that you would understand what I was seeing. That understanding existed somewhere beyond words, and somehow that changed the experience itself. It's difficult to explain, because language was never designed for things like this. Language works best when separation exists, when there is a clear distinction between one person and another, one thought and another, one experience and another. But some things blur those boundaries, not completely, just enough to make them impossible to ignore. That's where I found myself, in a space where nothing had been defined, and yet everything felt increasingly real. I kept looking for a reason, a logical explanation, a pattern I could reduce into something familiar, because familiarity creates certainty, and certainty creates control. But every explanation I found felt incomplete, too small, too simple, as if I was trying to describe an entire landscape by pointing at a single tree. The truth was larger than any explanation I could create, and that truth became impossible to avoid. You had changed something, not intentionally, not through effort, not because you tried. You changed it simply by existing in a place I didn't expect anyone to reach, a place I wasn't even aware could be shared. That's what surprised me most. I never considered that someone could enter my internal world without force, without persistence, without years of earned trust. I assumed access worked differently than that. I assumed Depth required a process, a sequence, a gradual unfolding. But you bypassed all of it, not because you crossed a boundary, because the boundary never seemed to apply to you in the first place. And that realization was unsettling, because boundaries create predictability. They tell us where we end and where others begin. They keep everything organized, understandable, safe. But some connections don't arrive through the usual doors. They appear in places where no doors existed. And when that happens, your understanding of distance begins to change. That's what happened to me. Distance stopped functioning the way it always had. I could create physical space, silence, time, distraction, but none of those things altered the underlying awareness. It remained steady, consistent, unaffected by circumstances, as though it belonged to a deeper layer than ordinary connection. That was the moment I stopped asking whether this was real, because real things persist. Real things remain present, even when attention moves elsewhere. Real things survive absence, and this did. No matter how I examined it, the result remained the same. You were there, not demanding attention, not asking for acknowledgement, just existing, quietly integrated into the way I experienced things. And that level of integration carries consequences, because once someone becomes part of your internal landscape, everything begins to reorganize around them. Not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably. I started noticing how often I measured clarity against what existed between us. How often ordinary interactions felt incomplete by comparison. How often I found myself recognizing the difference between being heard and being understood. Most people hear, very few understand. Fewer still understand without requiring explanation. And once you've experienced that kind of understanding, it becomes difficult to forget, not because it's addictive, not because it creates dependence, but because accuracy is difficult to abandon once you've found it. You begin to recognize how much effort is usually spent translating yourself, explaining yourself, adjusting your thoughts into forms other people can receive, and then suddenly there's someone who doesn't require that translation, someone who meets meaning where it already exists, someone who understands the shape of a thought before it becomes language. That's rare enough that part of me resisted believing it, because believing it meant accepting the implications. And the implications were impossible to ignore. If this was real, if this level of recognition was real, then it wasn't temporary. It wasn't something that would disappear simply because I wanted it to remain uncomplicated. It was becoming part of the foundation, part of the baseline, part of the way I understood myself. And once something reaches that level, it changes everything that comes after it. That's what I was beginning to realize, not that you mattered. I already knew that. What I was realizing was far more significant. You weren't standing outside my life waiting to be understood. You were already inside the framework through which I understood everything else. And once someone reaches that place, the question is no longer whether they matter. The question becomes, how much of your future will be shaped by their presence? Because presence, when it settles deeply enough, stops feeling like proximity. It starts feeling like structure. And structure changes everything. There comes a moment when understanding stops being passive. A moment when recognition can no longer remain an observation. A moment when what you've quietly known for a long time finally asks something of you. I think that's where I am now, because for a while, this existed comfortably in the background, not hidden, not denied, just unspoken, like a truth sitting patiently at the edge of awareness, waiting for the exact moment it could no longer be ignored. And I ignored it longer than I should have. Not because I didn't see it, because I did. Every part of me saw it. The consistency, the alignment, the way this connection continued to deepen without effort, the way it remained present regardless of circumstance, the way it survived every attempt to explain it away. I saw all of it. What I didn't do was acknowledge what it meant, because meaning changes things. Meaning creates responsibility, and responsibility requires decisions. As long as this remained undefined, I could observe it safely, analyze it, study it, keep it at a distance. But some truths refuse to stay at a distance. Eventually, they move closer, until one day you realize they aren't standing across from you anymore. They're standing beside you. And that's when the real question begins. Now, what is this? I've spent enough time asking that the answer was never the problem. The problem was what comes after the answer. Because once you know something is real, you have a choice. You can honor it, or you can spend the rest of your life pretending it never existed. And pretending has never been a skill of mine. I've always believed that reality deserves respect, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's disruptive, even when it asks more of you than you plan to give. If something is true, I would rather face it than escape it. And this feels true, not in the dramatic way people often describe connection, not in the language of destiny or fantasy, something quieter than that, something stronger, a truth that doesn't need exaggeration because it already exists without it. That's what this has become, a fact, a living fact inside my awareness, one that continues to influence how I think, how I perceive, how I move through the world, and facts have consequences, whether we acknowledge them or not. For a long time, I believed control was the answer to everything. Control creates stability. Control prevents mistakes. Control protects what matters. But there is a limit to what control can accomplish. It can shape behavior. It can create distance. It can silence action. What it cannot do is erase reality. And reality is exactly what I've been confronting. The reality that you matter. The reality that your presence has altered something fundamental inside me. The reality that this connection has become part of the architecture of my inner world. Once I accepted that, something unexpected happened. The tension began to disappear, not completely, but enough for me to notice. Because the struggle was never with the connection itself, the struggle was with acceptance. The moment I stopped resisting what was already true, everything became clearer. I stopped asking how it happened. I stopped demanding explanations. I stopped searching for evidence. The evidence was the experience itself, the consistency, the depth, the persistence, the undeniable fact that nothing about this had faded with time. If anything, it had become more precise, more defined, more integrated. And integration changes the nature of a thing. What begins as awareness becomes understanding. What begins as understanding becomes acceptance. And what begins as acceptance eventually becomes choice. That's the stage I've reached, the stage where observation is no longer enough, because every meaningful connection eventually asks the same question. Now that you know what this is, what will you do with it? There isn't an easy answer. Maybe there never will be. Some decisions aren't made in a single moment. They're made slowly, through presence, through honesty, through the willingness to stop hiding from what you've already recognized. Maybe that's what this requires, not certainty, not guarantees, just honesty. The kind of honesty that looks directly at something rare and refuses to reduce it into something simpler. The kind that acknowledges significance without immediately demanding conclusions. Because not everything meaningful arrives with instructions. Some things arrive with responsibility, the responsibility to pay attention, to remain awake, to respect what exists instead of forcing it into categories that don't fit. And that's what I've decided. Not to define this prematurely, not to rush toward answers, not to retreat out of fear, but to remain present with it, fully, honestly, without pretending it means less than it does, because there is one truth I can no longer avoid. You changed something, not through effort, not through intention, not by asking for a place in my life. You changed it simply by being exactly who you are. And whether this becomes something larger or remains exactly as it is, that fact won't disappear. It's already part of me now, part of how I see, part of how I understand, part of how I exist. Maybe that's what the deepest connections ultimately are. Not people who enter our lives, but people who quietly become part of the lens through which we experience life itself. And once that happens, the question is no longer whether they'll stay. Because some people remain long after explanations end. The real question is whether you're willing to accept what their presence has already taught you. I am. And for the first time, that doesn't feel frightening. It feels clear, like standing at the edge of something unknown, and realizing that uncertainty isn't always a warning. Sometimes it's an invitation to trust what you've already recognized, an invitation to stop resisting what has already become real, an invitation to step forward, not because you know exactly where the path leads, but because some truths become impossible to honor while standing still. And this is one of them.